Throughout the First Age and early Second, we see one of Sauron's most intriguing abilities at play. While others among Morgoth's servants would be bound to a single form, his chief lieutenant could transform into forms both fair and terrible. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we cover Sauron's physical form and his ability for shapeshifting. First, we'll note that as one of the Ainur, the group of higher beings in Tolkien's world which includes both the Valar and Maiar, Sauron did not have a physical form in the beginning. In his earliest days, he was known as Mairon, and was one of the Maiar to serve Aule, the smith of the Valar. Early on, however, his obsession with order would lead to his admiration of Melkor, and his fall to darkness. Just as his master, he would take a physical form as he follows Morgoth in his efforts to rule all of Arda. Others among the Ainur would take physical forms as well, whether temporarily, like the Vala Ulmo, or more permanently, like Melian the Maya, who would marry the elf king Thingol. Unlike Sauron, who could shapeshift, Morgoth's other famous Maiar servants would be bound to a form of shadow and flame, as the Balrogs. This embodiment of the Ainur is known as Fana, and as we'll see, using their power on such a form would come with a price. In the First Age, we read of Morgoth's chief lieutenant. Sauron was become now a sorcerer of dreadful power, master of shadows and of phantoms, foul in wisdom, cruel in strength, misshaping what he touched, twisting what he ruled. Lord of werewolves, his dominion was torment. In one of Sauron's first fortresses, the Isle of Tol Gauroth, he rules over evil creatures like the werewolves for which the isle is named. Unlike werewolves in the traditional sense, Tolkien's werewolves are large wolves in which Sauron had imprisoned evil spirits. And it's at this fortress that Sauron's shape-shifting ability comes into play. For when Sauron had captured the man Beren and the elf king Finrod in his dungeons, Luthien and Huan the Hound come to Tol Gauroth, and one by one, Huan kills the werewolves of Sauron. Therefore, he took upon himself the form of a werewolf, and made himself the mightiest that had yet walked the world, and he came forth to win the passage of the bridge. So great was the horror of his approach that Huan leaped aside. Then Sauron sprang upon Luthien, and she swooned before the menace of the fell spirit in his eyes, and the foul vapor of his breath. But even as he came, falling, she cast a fold of her dark cloak before his eyes, and he stumbled, for a fleeting drowsiness came upon him. Then Huan sprang. There befell the battle of Huan and Wolf Sauron, and the howls and baying echoed in the hills, and the watchers on the walls of Eredwethrin across the valley heard it afar and were dismayed. But no wizardry nor spell, neither fang nor venom, nor devil's art nor beast's strength could overthrow Huan of Valinor, and he took his foe by the throat and pinned him down. Then Sauron shifted shape from wolf to serpent, and from monster to his own accustomed form. But he could not elude the grip of Huan without forsaking his body utterly. Ere his foul spirit left its dark house, Luthien came to him and said that he could be stripped of his raiment of flesh, and his ghost be sent quaking back to Morgoth. And she said, "There everlastingly thy naked self shall endure the torment of his scorn, pierced by his eyes, unless thou yield to me the mastery of thy tower." Then Sauron yielded himself, and Luthien took the mastery of the isle and all that was there, and Huan released him. And immediately he took the form of a vampire, great as a dark cloud across the moon, and he fled, dripping blood from his throat upon the trees, and came to Tar Nufuin, and dwelt there, filling it with horror. In this quick succession, we see Sauron shift his form from werewolf to serpent, to his regular physical form, and finally escaping in the form of a vampire. A quick note, like werewolves, Tolkien's vampires are not what you would immediately think of from popular fiction. Tolkien's vampires are instead giant bat creatures. In this passage, we also get a hint that despite being a truly immortal being, Sauron shows reluctance to abandon his physical form. He gives the rule of the fortress to Luthien rather than forsake his body. This will come into play again in both the Second and Third Ages. Interestingly, while Sauron is arguably the Tolkien character most associated with shapeshifting, we see a similar talent displayed by some famous elves of the First Age. Luthien, after defeating Sauron, disguises herself and Beren as a vampire and werewolf to infiltrate Morgoth's fortress of Angband. And earlier in the same tale, Finrod had used his power to disguise himself, Beren, and their small company of elves as orcs, though Sauron himself would throw off this disguise when they are captured. While it's not entirely clear, this may be a different ability altogether, more of an ability to disguise their true physical form by illusion, rather than taking a completely different shape themselves. While we won't cover it in this video, Sauron also possesses a great ability for illusions. We next hear from Sauron after the War of Wrath, and his master's defeat at the hands of the host of the Valar. It is then that Sauron takes on a fair form, and out of fear of the Valar, repents of his evil deeds. When he is told by Eonwe that he should return to Valinor to receive judgment, Sauron instead flees to hide in Middle-earth. What form he takes at this point, we don't know. We only know that for 500 years, he hides himself, likely in the east. Around the year 500 of the Second Age, Sauron decides the Valar have abandoned Middle-earth to its own devices, and turns to evil plans. Once again, he takes on a fair visage, with which to trick the elves. Despite knowing men were easier to sway, he opts for the elves as they are inherently more powerful. Along with his form, he takes the name Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. And while Elrond and Gil-galad of Lindon did not trust him and refused to treat with him, they could not tell his true identity. After successfully tricking the elves of Eregion into making the Rings of Power, the War of the Elves and Sauron begins. While he would initially see great success in this war, he is ultimately repelled thanks to the arrival of the Numenorians coming to Gil-galad's aid. Over 1,500 years after his defeat, Sauron has once again built up his armies, and begins assuming titles such as King of Men and Lord of the Earth. Offended by this, Ar-Pharazôn brings a mighty fleet to Middle-earth, and so great is its splendor that Sauron's servants abandon him. Knowing he cannot win through strength of arms, Sauron returns to his old method of treachery, once again assuming a fair form. In a remarkably short time, Sauron becomes chief counselor to the king, and is known as Zigur the Wizard. In a chain of events explained in detail in other videos, Sauron leads Numenor down the path of destruction, which comes at a great cost to Sauron himself. For he is on the island of Numenor when the destroying wave comes, and his physical form is destroyed in the downfall. His spirit survives, though he is severely weakened. From that day on, he would be unable to ever again take a fair form. As such, we see Sauron from now on as we know him best. A terrible form, slightly greater in stature than a man, and described as an image of malice and hatred made visible. Over 100 years after Numenor's downfall, Sauron begins to attack Gondor, and in response, the last alliance of elves and men is formed, in a final effort to overthrow the Dark Lord. As we know, Gil-galad and Elendil would succeed in throwing down Sauron, though both would die in the deed. Isildur cuts the One Ring from his hand, and Sauron flees his physical form. And for the second time, we see Sauron lose his physical body. Each time this happens, it takes a mighty toll, and takes Sauron longer to regain physical form. First, he loses the ability to assume a fair form, and is forced to flee back to Mordor as a spirit from the downfallen Numenor. This time, we would see it take far longer. as he only begins to take shape in a physical body again around 1,000 years into the Third Age. Around this same time, and due to the threat of a returning Sauron, the Valar send other Maiar to Middle-earth, also bound in a physical form to aid the Free Peoples, the Istari, or Wizards. Sauron would begin his return in the Forest of Greenwood, taking over the former elven capital of Amon Lunk, and making it into the fortress of Dol Guldur. While we're not told about his physical form during this time, aside from being known as the Necromancer, we see the shadow of Sauron begin to play a role. Now, the term shadow is used throughout Tolkien's works in reference to the effects of evil, and hinted at as a power held by dark forces. While not a physical form, I think it's worth mentioning as it comes into play during this time period. It is this shadow coming to Greenwood that transforms it into Mirkwood, bringing evil things to the forest, such as spiders. And it's this shadow's presence that tips off Gandalf to Sauron's reemergence. As we know, Sauron would eventually be expelled by the attack of the White Council in 2941. Sauron, however, had long planned for this, and flees to Mordor. Here we would see Sauron's shadow cause more havoc upon Gondor. We are told this shadow of Mordor would bring despair and even sickness to the Gondorians. Denethor's wife Finduilas would be one of those affected, and after 4 years of struggle, she dies at the age of 38. During his wife's sickness, Denethor desperately turns to the use of the Palantir of Minas Tirith. Sauron, who presumably now has fully returned to a physical form, wields the Palantir taken from the former Minas Ithil, and seeks to bend the steward to his will. However, unlike Saruman, who would become one of the Dark Lord's greatest allies, Denethor shows remarkable strength in resisting Sauron, though this mental fight with the Dark Lord would cause great stress and age him prematurely. When Frodo looks in the mirror of Galadriel, we get a description of Sauron's eye specifically, where it is said it is yellow and rimmed with fire, with a slit pupil, a window into nothing. Our final description of Sauron's physical form during the War of the Ring comes from one who saw him in person. For prior to being captured by Aragorn, Gollum had been tortured by the Dark Lord for information on the One Ring. He tells Frodo and Sam in the Two Towers,
"Yes, he has only 4 on the Black Hand, but they are enough."
This point further emphasizes that each destruction of Sauron's physical form comes at a great cost. First, he loses his ability to take a fair form in the fall of Numenor. Then, when defeated in the War of the Last Alliance, it takes him far longer to return to physical form. And even then, we see he is left scarred by missing the finger cut by Isildur. Sauron would ultimately be vanquished when the One Ring is destroyed in Mount Doom. In his defeat, there would be one last dark visage of the Lord of Mordor, as experienced by the men of the West at the Battle of the Morannon.
"Stand, men of the West! Stand and wait! This is the hour of doom!"
And even as Gandalf spoke, the earth rocked beneath their feet. Then rising swiftly up, far above the towers of the Black Gate, high above the mountains, a vast soaring darkness sprang into the sky, flickering with fire. The earth groaned and quaked. The towers of the Teeth swayed, tottered, and fell down. The mighty rampart crumbled. The Black Gate was hurled in ruin, and from far away, now dim, now growing, now mounting to the clouds, there came a drumming rumble, a roar, a long echoing roll of ruinous noise.
"The realm of Sauron is ended," said Gandalf. "The Ring-bearer has fulfilled his quest."
And as the captains gazed south to the land of Mordor, it seemed to them that, black against the pall of cloud, there rose a huge shape of shadow, impenetrable, lightning-crowned, filling all the sky. Enormous, it reared above the world, and stretched out toward them a vast, threatening hand, terrible but impotent. For even as it leaned over them, a great wind took it, and it was all blown away and passed, and then a hush fell. While he was indeed an immortal being, the destruction of Sauron's ruling ring, which he had poured much of his own power into, leaves him permanently incapacitated. In Gandalf's words, he is maimed forever, becoming a mere spirit of malice that gnaws itself in the shadows, but cannot again grow or take shape. Now that we've covered Sauron's physical form and his shape-shifting abilities, what other videos on this character or others would you like to see here on the channel? What burning questions do you have about Middle-earth that you'd like to see me tackle in their own video? Let me know in the comments. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil 19, Listen Me the Cinda, Celebrimbor, The Mighty Mim, Team Weasel, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, Toby Mob's Music, CCDC Red Team, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Salim Rahman, Zetrock, Berto Berg, Grand Strategy Nerd, Graham Darricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Michael Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description and purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching and subscribing, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.